A 4-year-old girl pulled a blanket off her grandmother's body and watched blood leak from multiple gunshot wounds. Her grandmother's boyfriend lay dying beside her, blood flowing from his mouth as he struggled for his final breaths. And the man who pulled the trigger? Her own father, who just executed his mother while his daughter hid under a table, then calmly called 911 without ever admitting he was the killer. This is the true story of Javonte Morris, a 21-year-old son who murdered his mother after she tried to evict him from her home. And the warning signs? They were screaming for days. Friday, December 26, 2025, the day after Christmas. While most families were still unwrapping gifts and enjoying leftovers, Marcus Jones was texting his girlfriend's cousin with an urgent warning. Javonte Morris had been talking about he will smoke her. Street slang meaning he was threatening to kill his own mother. The language Marcus used wasn't accidental. Smoke her is deliberate terminology in street culture. It means murder, execution, taking someone's life. This wasn't Marcus being dramatic or misinterpreting angry words. He was documenting genuine death threats, creating a text record that would later become evidence in a double homicide investigation. Marcus recognized the danger. He was trying to sound the alarm. Nivia Phillips, 38 years old, lived in apartment 22500 Jackson Court in Richton Park, Illinois, a working-class suburb about 30 miles south of Chicago. The apartment complex was typical of the area. Affordable housing where families tried to build stable lives despite economic pressures. Nivia shared this space with her 21-year-old son Javonte and his 4-year-old daughter. Marcus Jones, 45, was Nivia's boyfriend who stayed at the apartment intermittently, integrating himself into what should have been a family dynamic but had instead become something toxic and dangerous. The living arrangement had been deteriorating for months, possibly years. Javonte was 21, legally an adult, old enough to vote, old enough to be fully responsible for himself and his daughter. But he wasn't contributing financially to the household. He wasn't working steadily or paying rent. He wasn't helping with expenses or showing appreciation for his mother's continued support. Instead, he was freeloading while creating chaos, disrespecting Nivia in her own home, making her life increasingly unbearable. If you're still watching, you're clearly interested in real cases told in full. Like, share, subscribe now, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss what comes next. Because this case reveals the dark reality of what happens when warning signs are dismissed until it's too late. That Friday evening, Nivia texted her cousin expressing the frustration that had been building to a breaking point. She declared her intention to put him out of the house, to evict her own son. 21 years old, was old enough to support himself. She'd tolerated the disrespect long enough. She'd enabled his refusal to launch into independent adulthood for too long. The chaos consuming her home had to end. She needed peace. She needed her space back. She needed to stop being taken advantage of by the son she'd raised for over 2 decades. The cousin's response came immediately, and it was chilling in its simplicity. "You should have called the police." Think about what that response reveals. The cousin wasn't surprised by Nivia's declaration. They weren't shocked that Javonte's behavior had reached this point. They already knew the situation was dangerous enough that police intervention should have happened already. This wasn't the first conversation about Javonte's threatening behavior. It was just the first time Nivia had decided to take definitive action. And even then, her cousin recognized that eviction without police protection could be catastrophic. But Nivia didn't call police. Perhaps she believed she could handle her own son, that maternal authority would prevail over his anger. Perhaps she thought the threats were empty posturing, the kind of dramatic words people say when they're upset but don't actually mean. Perhaps she was trapped in that psychological prison where mothers cannot see their children as genuine threats, even when evidence screams otherwise. The maternal bond is supposed to be protective, nurturing, unconditional. The idea that her own son might actually harm her probably felt impossible to fully accept. Saturday, December 27th dawned like any other winter day in suburban Chicago. Cold, gray. The kind of day where people stay inside, maybe watch TV, maybe argue because cabin fever and family proximity create friction. The tension that had been building for days was about to reach its catastrophic breaking point. Nivia texted her cousin again. The message was stark. stripped of any ambiguity. Morris was talking about shooting her. Not he's angry, not he's upset, not he's making vague threats. He was explicitly, specifically threatening to shoot his mother. The threat had escalated from general violence to gunfire, and Nivia was scared enough to document it, to reach out, to let someone else know what was happening inside that apartment. Then came the phone call that would haunt her cousin for the rest of their life. Nivia called, likely needing to hear a supportive voice, needing reassurance, needing connection to the outside world while trapped in an increasingly dangerous situation. During their conversation, the cousin heard Javonte in the background. Not just arguing, not just yelling, threatening Nivia's life directly, his voice carrying through the phone line with unmistakable menace. He was warning that if police came to the apartment, there would be a shootout. Let that sink in. Javonte wasn't saying he'd comply with police. He wasn't saying he'd leave peacefully. He was promising violence, a shootout, implying he was armed and willing to engage in gunfire with law enforcement. This wasn't empty threat. This was someone who'd already decided that violence was his solution. And then, the sound that transformed fear into absolute terror. The unmistakable metallic click-clack of a firearm being racked, a slide being pulled back, a round being chambered into firing position, the mechanical sound of a gun being prepared to kill. Javonte was screaming death threats while simultaneously loading the weapon to fulfill them. He wasn't hiding his intentions. He wasn't being subtle. He was performing his rage and his murderous intent, making sure his mother and her cousin both heard the gun being prepared. This was psychological torture combined with genuine threat. He wanted them to know what was coming, wanted them to be afraid, wanted them to understand he had the weapon and the will to use it. The cousin was helpless on that phone line, hearing murder being prepared in real time but unable to physically stop it. Unable to reach through the phone and disarm Javonte. Unable to protect Nivia despite knowing exactly what was about to happen. That helplessness, that horror of knowing someone you love is in mortal danger and being unable to save them, creates trauma that never fully heals. At 6:35 p.m., the cousin made the decision Nivia should have made days earlier. They called 911. Emergency dispatchers received the call reporting threats and a weapon at apartment 22500 Jackson Court. Police were dispatched immediately, 1 minute later, according to official timelines. Officers were being sent to a domestic violence situation with confirmed weapon and explicit threats to kill. But for Nivia Phillips and Marcus Jones, help was already coming too late. The distance between the 911 call and police arrival would be measured in minutes. The time it took Javonte to pull the trigger would be measured in seconds. And seconds always win that race. At 6:37 p.m., just 2 minutes after the cousin's desperate 911 call, Javonte Morris himself dialed emergency services. But here's what makes this chilling. He reported a shooting at the residence without ever identifying himself as the shooter. While dispatchers asked questions, while his mother and her boyfriend lay dying or dead in pools of blood, while his 4-year-old daughter processed the horror she'd just witnessed, Javonte Morris was already running. He fled the apartment and headed less than a mile away to the 3800 block of Canterbury Court, hiding behind a garage. And incredibly, he stayed on the phone with 911 the entire time. Operators tracked his location through the call. When police arrived at 6:43 p.m., just 6 minutes after his initial call, they found him exactly where the phone signal indicated. Calm, waiting, acting like a witness instead of a perpetrator. Back at apartment 22500 Jackson Court, officers made entry expecting to find victims who might still be saved. Instead, they discovered a massacre. Nivia Phillips lay unresponsive with multiple gunshot wounds. Marcus Jones was beside her, also shot multiple times, his body already cooling. Both would be pronounced dead at 8:40 p.m. The Cook County Medical Examiner would later confirm what was obvious: death by multiple gunshot wounds. The apartment told its forensic story in brutal detail. 5 shell casings were scattered across the bedroom floor, evidence of close-range execution. A .380 Smith & Wesson bodyguard pistol was recovered from the living room, the murder weapon that had just ended 2 lives. for projectiles would eventually be recovered from the victims' bodies during autopsy. But then officers found her, the 4-year-old girl, Javonte's daughter, Nivia's granddaughter. She was hiding under a table near her toy boxes, physically unharmed but psychologically destroyed in ways that wouldn't fully manifest for years. This child had watched her father murder her grandmother. She'd witnessed Marcus Jones dying. And what she would tell investigators in the coming days would be even more horrifying than the crime scene itself. Neighbors had heard the chaos erupt. "It was loud," one told reporters. "My window is over there. It was loud. I heard screams. The sounds of gunfire, of people dying, of a family being annihilated in seconds. All of it carried through the thin apartment walls into neighboring units where people were just trying to enjoy their Saturday evening." Another neighbor who knew Nivia personally spoke to the media, her voice breaking with emotion. "She was a good lady. She was real sweet. A simple tribute to a woman whose life had been stolen by the son she'd raised for 21 years. A woman who'd only wanted her grown child to finally take responsibility for himself." Javonte Morris was taken into custody without incident. No resistance, no confession, no visible remorse. Just a 21-year-old man who'd called 911, reported a shooting like he was an innocent bystander, then waited behind a garage for police to find him while his victims bled out in the apartment he'd fled. The forensic interview with a 4-year-old witness requires extraordinary care, precision, and expertise that most people don't understand. Children at that age don't process trauma the way adults do. Their memories fragment differently. Their understanding of time, sequence, and causation operates on a developmental level that makes them simultaneously unreliable and brutally honest witnesses. They can't lie convincingly about complex events, but they can confuse details, mix up sequences, or misunderstand what they saw. Leading questions can contaminate recall, plant suggestions that become false memories the child genuinely believes. Suggestive language can transform unclear recollections into confident but inaccurate testimony. That's why forensic interviewers undergo specialized training in extracting information from child witnesses without causing additional harm or compromising the integrity of their testimony. These professionals understand child development, trauma responses, memory formation. They know how to ask open-ended questions that elicit organic recall rather than coached responses. They know how to create safe environments where children feel comfortable sharing what they witnessed without feeling pressured to say what they think adults want to hear. The interview with Javonte Morris' 4-year-old daughter would be conducted by such a professional, likely at a child advocacy center rather than a police station, in a room designed to feel comfortable rather than institutional, with the interview recorded for later review by prosecutors and defense attorneys. The interviewer would have spent time building rapport first, talking about neutral topics, ensuring the child felt safe before asking about traumatic events. And what this little girl revealed was even more horrifying than the crime scene itself. Because while physical evidence shows what happened, only witness testimony shows how it felt to be there. During the interview, the girl told police her father had shot her grandmother, whom she knew by the affectionate name Gigi, and Marcus Jones following an argument between the three of them. Even at 4 years old, she understood cause and effect well enough to connect the argument to the violence that followed. She explained that her grandmother had told Javonte she was going to put him out of the house, evict him, make him leave, force him to be independent, and that's when he shot them both. The motive was clear even through a 4-year-old's limited understanding of adult conflicts. Her grandmother tried to make her father leave, so her father killed her grandmother. Simple, direct, the kind of brutal logic that children apply to events they witness but can't fully comprehend. She didn't understand concepts like financial dependency, toxic family dynamics, or the psychological pressure that builds when adult children refuse to launch. She just knew that Gigi said Daddy had to leave, and then Daddy hurt Gigi in ways that made her stop moving. As we continue, like, share, subscribe, and turn on notification. But then the interview reached the part that would haunt everyone who heard it. Prosecutors, defense attorneys, judges, jury members if the case went to trial, anyone who read the transcripts or watched the recorded interview. Because the girl didn't just describe the shooting. She described what happened after the gunfire stopped. After the deafening explosions in an enclosed space. After watching 2 people collapse to the floor. What she did next reveals both the innocence of a child trying to help and the trauma that will haunt her for the rest of her life. The little girl told police she had pulled a blanket off her grandmother and saw leaking blood. Those words, leaking blood, would appear in police reports, prosecutor proffers, court documents, media coverage. Think about that phrasing. Leaking, not flowing, not pooling, not gushing, leaking. Like something broken that can't hold what it's supposed to contain. Like liquid escaping from a container that's been punctured beyond repair. Like a slow, inevitable seepage that can't be stopped. She was trying to understand what was happening with the limited vocabulary and conceptual framework of a 4-year-old. Perhaps she thought pulling the blanket away would help somehow. Would let her see how badly Gigi was hurt. Would let her do something to make it better. Perhaps she was simply confused about why her grandmother wasn't moving and needed to investigate. Perhaps some instinct drove her to check, to confirm, to see for herself what her young mind couldn't fully process. Instead of finding her grandmother sleeping or resting or somehow okay despite what she'd just witnessed, she saw blood spreading from multiple gunshot wounds. Blood soaking through clothing, through skin, through the fundamental barrier that's supposed to keep life inside a body. Blood leaking in ways that couldn't be fixed with band-aids or kisses or any of the remedies children understand. Her grandmother's life was literally draining away onto the carpet, and a 4-year-old child watched it happen while trying to understand why pulling away a blanket didn't make things better. Then she turned her attention to Marcus Jones, and what she described reveals that he was still alive when she looked at him. Still conscious, still aware, still experiencing those final terrible moments before death claimed him. Breathing really hard and leaking blood out of his mouth. Those words, spoken by a 4-year-old trying to describe something no child should witness, paint a picture of Marcus Jones' final moments that's almost unbearable to contemplate. He'd been shot multiple times. Bullets had torn through his body, damaging organs, tearing blood vessels, creating internal injuries that were bleeding faster than his body could compensate. His lungs were filling with blood, either from direct damage to lung tissue or from blood flowing into airways from other wounds. Each breath became a struggle. Each attempt to inhale drew blood deeper into passages meant for air. He was literally drowning in his own blood while a 4-year-old child watched. Breathing really hard, gasping, struggling, fighting for each breath as his body's systems failed. The respiratory distress of someone whose lungs can't function properly anymore. The desperation of suffocation combined with blood loss. The final autonomic responses of a body trying to survive even when survival is no longer possible. Leaking blood out of his mouth. Visible evidence of internal hemorrhaging. Blood flowing from his mouth with each labored breath. The metallic taste of it filling his throat. The horror of feeling your own life fluid escaping from places it should never escape from. Marcus Jones was conscious and aware during at least some of this. He knew he was dying. He knew he couldn't stop it. And a 4-year-old girl witnessed his suffering. Think about what that child saw in those moments. Her grandmother motionless with blood spreading around her. Marcus Jones struggling to breathe while blood flowed from his mouth. The sounds he must have made, the wet, rattling breaths of someone drowning, the gasps and gurgles that accompany that kind of respiratory failure. The sight of blood appearing with each exhale, bubbling at his lips, running down his chin. The gradual slowing of those struggles as his body gave up the fight. How long did she watch? Seconds? Minutes? How long before she finally hid under that table near her toys, making herself small and invisible, waiting for the nightmare to end? How long before her father fled the apartment, leaving her alone with 2 dying or dead people? How long before police arrived and found her there, traumatized beyond what any child should ever experience? These aren't details a 4-year-old could fabricate. They're not coached testimony or planted memories. They're trauma memories seared into her developing brain, visceral, sensory images that will resurface in nightmares and flashbacks for decades. The blanket, the leaking blood, Marcus struggling to breathe, her grandmother motionless on the floor. These images are now permanent features of her psychological landscape, installed by her father's actions on December 27, 2025. The child's testimony would be crucial for prosecutors building their case against Javonte Morris. Illinois law allows children's forensic interviews to be admitted as evidence if they meet specific criteria for reliability and trustworthiness. Defense attorneys can challenge these interviews, arguing that questioning techniques were suggestive or that the child's memory isn't reliable enough for courtroom use. But when interviews are conducted properly by trained professionals, when children provide sensory details and sequence information that matches physical evidence, when their testimony is internally consistent and externally corroborated, courts generally allow it. And this girl's account did all of that. It placed Javonte at the scene with the murder weapon. It established his motive clearly, eviction threat triggering violence. It confirmed the sequence of events, argument, then shooting, then aftermath. It provided sensory details, the leaking blood, Marcus breathing hard, that matched what medical examiners would later document about wound patterns and cause of death. Most damningly, it demonstrated these murders occurred in front of his own daughter, an aggravating factor that would weigh heavily during any sentencing phase. On Tuesday, December 31st, 2025, New Year's Eve, while the rest of America prepared to celebrate the arrival of 2026, the Cook County State's Attorney's Office formally charged Javonte D. Morris, 21, with 2 counts of first-degree murder. Each count represented a separate victim: Nivia Phillips, his mother; Marcus Jones, her boyfriend. The charges were filed in the Circuit Court of Cook County, the jurisdiction where Richton Park is located. He was ordered detained without bond while awaiting trial. No amount of money could secure his release. The nature of the charges, double homicide, matricide, committed in front of a child witness, made him too dangerous and too much of a flight risk for any judge to consider bail. He would remain in Cook County Jail custody from arrest through resolution of his case, whether that came through plea agreement or trial verdict. Nivia Phillips should be alive right now. At 38 years old, she should be planning her 39th birthday in just a few months. She should be thinking about where she and Marcus would go for their next date night. Maybe trying that new restaurant in the area, or catching a movie, or just enjoying quiet time together watching TV on the couch like couples do. She should be watching her granddaughter learn to read, helping with homework, attending school events, being the involved grandmother she clearly wanted to be. She should be living the life she'd worked so hard to build after decades of struggling as a single mother. Instead, her body spent time in the Cook County Medical Examiner's office. Multiple gunshot wounds documented with clinical precision. Organs weighed and examined. Tissue samples taken for toxicology screening. Photographs of injuries taken from every angle for evidence presentation. All the invasive, dehumanizing procedures that come after violent death, reducing a whole person to forensic data and autopsy reports. Toxicology screens came back showing Nivia was completely sober when her son executed her. No alcohol in her system. No drugs, not recreational, not prescription. Nothing that impaired her judgment or explained her actions. She was clear-headed when she made the decision to evict Javonte. She was sober when she sent those final texts to her cousin expressing fear. She was fully aware when she heard her son rack that gun while threatening her life. And she was conscious and cognizant when he actually pulled the trigger, assuming she survived long enough to process what was happening. The last moments of her life weren't blurred by intoxication. She experienced every second with terrible clarity. Single motherhood had defined Nivia's adult life for over 2 decades. She'd raised Javonte alone from birth through adulthood, 21 years of solo parenting with all the challenges that entails. The father was apparently absent or uninvolved. Public records and media coverage never mentioned him, suggesting he either abandoned the family early or was never significantly present. Nivia shouldered every responsibility alone. Financial pressure of being sole provider, time constraints of managing work and childcare solo, emotional exhaustion of having no partner to share the load, social judgment that single mothers face regardless of circumstances. Society has a cruel double standard for single mothers. When their children struggle, drop out of school, get in trouble with law, fail to launch into independent adulthood, people blame the mother. She must not have disciplined him enough. She probably spoiled him. Single-parent households always produce troubled kids. The mother bears responsibility for every failure. But when children succeed despite growing up in single-parent households, that success is attributed to the child's character, not the mother's sacrifice and dedication. Nivia did everything she could. She gave Javonte shelter, food, clothing, education opportunities, emotional support. She raised him for 21 years, and he repaid her with bullets. The decision to evict him wasn't sudden, impulsive, or cruel. It came after years, possibly a lifetime, of tolerating chaos, disrespect, and refusal to contribute. Nivia had reached what psychologists call the breaking point. That moment when continuing to enable someone becomes more destructive than forcing them to face consequences. She'd probably made excuses for Javonte's behavior for years, probably told herself he'd mature eventually, probably convinced herself that one more chance, one more conversation, one more accommodation would finally motivate him to change. But nothing changed. Javonte was 21 years old, legally an adult, old enough to vote and sign contracts and be held fully responsible under criminal law. But he wasn't acting like an adult. He wasn't working steadily or contributing financially to household expenses. He wasn't paying rent or utilities. He wasn't buying groceries or helping with cleaning or showing basic appreciation for his mother's continued support. Instead, he was freeloading while making her life increasingly miserable through disrespect, chaos, and eventually explicit threats. When someone reaches their breaking point, the decision that follows feels simultaneously overdue and terrifying. Nivia knew she needed Javonte out of her apartment. She knew enabling him was destroying her own quality of life. She knew 21 years old was past time for him to be independent. But actually saying, "I'm putting you out of the house," required courage. The courage to set a boundary, to prioritize her own well-being, to risk her son's anger by refusing to continue subsidizing his refusal to grow up. That courage cost her everything. Her relationship with Marcus Jones represented hope after years of struggling alone as a single mother. At 45, Marcus was 7 years older than Nivia, mature, established, someone who'd already navigated the challenges of adulthood and come out stable on the other side. He wasn't a project or a fixer-upper. He was a genuine partner, someone who could share responsibilities rather than create additional burdens. They'd been together long enough that Marcus was integrated into family dynamics. He was texting Nivia's cousin about concerns over Javonte's behavior. He was staying at the apartment regularly, contributing to household life, becoming part of their world rather than just a visitor. That level of integration suggests they were serious about each other, probably discussing a future together, maybe moving in officially, maybe marriage eventually, at minimum a committed long-term relationship where they supported each other through life's challenges. Marcus wasn't just Nivia's boyfriend. He was her partner, her confidant, the person who made single motherhood slightly less lonely after decades of doing it completely alone. And then he died in her apartment because her son couldn't handle being told to leave. The cousin Nivia confided in was clearly her closest friend and confidant, someone who functioned almost like a sister. They communicated daily about serious family issues, not just superficial holiday greetings or occasional check-ins, but deep conversations about real problems. This cousin knew about Javonte's threats. They knew about Nivia's plan to evict him. They knew the situation was dangerous enough to warrant immediate police intervention. That level of trust and openness reveals character. Nivia wasn't isolated like many domestic violence victims become when abusers systematically cut them off from support systems. She had someone who listened. She had someone who believed her when she expressed fear. She had someone who urged her to protect herself by calling police. But she didn't make that call. And that decision haunts everyone who loved her, especially the cousin who tried so hard to convince her the situation required law enforcement intervention. The texts between Nivia and her cousin tell the story of a woman who recognized danger but couldn't bring herself to believe her own son would actually kill her. "He's talking about shooting me." Those words carry terror, but also cognitive dissonance. Mothers aren't supposed to fear their children. The maternal bond is supposed to be sacred, protective, unbreakable. Evolution wired mothers to defend their children against threats, not to see their children as threats themselves. For some mothers, that evolutionary programming becomes a psychological prison. They can't fully process that their child, the baby they held, the toddler they potty trained, the teenager they worried about, the young adult they're still trying to guide, has become someone genuinely dangerous to them. They see warning signs but explain them away. They experience fear but override it with maternal instinct, insisting their child would never really hurt them. They recognize threats but can't translate that recognition into protective action because doing so feels like betraying the fundamental parent-child bond. Nivia fell into that trap. She knew Javonte was threatening her. She told her cousin he was talking about shooting her. But some part of her brain probably couldn't accept that the son she'd raised for 21 years would actually pull that trigger. Maybe she thought he was just venting anger. Maybe she believed he'd calm down once he realized she was serious about eviction. Maybe she convinced herself that maternal authority would ultimately prevail, that when push came to shove, he wouldn't actually be capable of murdering his own mother. She was wrong, and that mistake cost her her life. Marcus Jones wasn't supposed to die on December 27, 2025. He was 45 years old, middle-aged, with decades of life experience behind him and theoretically decades more ahead. He was a devoted father to his own 2 children from previous relationships, maintaining involvement in their lives even as he built a new relationship with Nivia. He'd lived a full adult life. Career experiences, relationships that succeeded and failed, personal growth that developed him into someone mature enough that Nivia Phillips found him attractive as a long-term partner. He'd found love after previous relationship struggles. He was building something meaningful. He was happy. And then he was murdered for the simple, tragic, senseless act of being in the wrong apartment at the wrong time when a 21-year-old man decided to execute his mother. Marcus died because he was dating a woman whose son had become homicidal. That's the brutal, irreducible truth of his death. If he'd stayed home that Saturday evening, if he'd been at his own place instead of Nivia's apartment at 22500 Jackson Court, he'd still be alive. His children would still have their father. His family wouldn't have planned a funeral. His friends wouldn't have gathered to mourn. But he was integrated enough into Nivia's life that he was present when her son exploded into violence. And that presence, that commitment to being there for his girlfriend, cost him absolutely everything. The texts Marcus sent to Nivia's cousin on Friday, December 26th, prove he was actively trying to protect her. Talking about he will smoke her, Marcus wasn't ignoring red flags or dismissing concerns as paranoid overreaction. He saw the situation with clear eyes. Javonte was making explicit death threats using language that left no ambiguity about his intentions. Smoke her isn't vague. It's specific street terminology for murder. As we go on, like, share, subscribe, and hit the notification. Understood what it meant. He recognized the danger. And he did what good partners do. He documented the threats, alerted Nivia's family support system, tried to ensure someone else knew what was happening inside that apartment. He stayed at the apartment despite knowing Javonte was making threats. That decision represents either remarkable courage or tragic underestimation of how quickly threats can become lethal action. Maybe Marcus believed his physical presence would deter violence, that Javonte wouldn't act as long as a witness was there, that having an adult male in the apartment would force Javonte to control himself. Maybe he didn't want to leave Nivia alone with someone making death threats, didn't want her facing that danger by herself, felt protective responsibility to stay and shield her if necessary. Maybe they thought they could de-escalate the situation together. Maybe they'd had conversations where they agreed on strategies. Stay calm, don't engage with his anger, give him time to cool down, maybe eventually convince him that moving out was actually in his best interest. Maybe they underestimated how fragile the situation was, how close to explosion the pressure had built, how little time remained before threats became actions. Whatever Marcus's reasoning for staying, the decision cost him his life. And the unfairness of that, the sheer randomness of dying in someone else's family conflict, makes his death even more tragic. When the shooting started, Marcus couldn't save himself or Nivia. Multiple gunshot wounds, close range, execution-style violence that gave him no time to react, no opportunity to defend, no chance to intervene. The forensic evidence would eventually reveal specifics. Which shots hit him first, whether he was facing Javonte or had his back turned, whether he tried to charge at the gunman or dove for cover or froze in shock. He might have tried to intervene, to physically stop Javonte, to grab for the gun, to disarm him before he could hurt Nivia. That would be consistent with Marcus's character as protective partner who'd been trying to keep Nivia safe. Or he might have been shot first, immediately, eliminated as the primary threat before Javonte turned the gun on his mother. That would be consistent with calculated violence. Take out the strongest person in the room first, then deal with the intended target. Either scenario is horrific. Either way, Marcus experienced those terrible moments between being shot and losing consciousness. The pain of bullets tearing through flesh and organs. The shock as his body registered catastrophic damage. The fear as he realized he was dying and couldn't stop it. The possible regret that he hadn't forced Nivia to leave this dangerous situation earlier, or hadn't called police himself when threats started, or had stayed that evening when maybe he should have taken Nivia somewhere else for safety. The 4-year-old girl's description of his final moments adds unbearable detail to his death. Breathing really hard and leaking blood out of his mouth, which means his wounds weren't immediately fatal. He didn't die instantly when bullets hit him. He lingered, struggled, suffered through those final seconds or minutes while his respiratory system failed and blood filled spaces where air should be. How long was he conscious? How long did he experience the horror of drowning in his own blood while unable to call for help because his mouth was full of blood? Did he try to speak? Did he want to tell the little girl to hide, to run, to get help? Did he look at Nivia, knowing she was already dead or dying, feeling the helplessness of watching someone he loved being murdered while he was too injured to save her? Did he see Javonte standing there, gun in hand, having just shot them both? Did he make eye contact with the man who'd killed him? Did he feel rage or just confusion? Why would someone do this? What did I do to deserve dying here? How is this happening? Or was he beyond coherent thought by then, just experiencing raw physical sensation as his body shut down? Marcus Jones' family now grieves a death that defies rational processing. He wasn't involved in the mother-son conflict that triggered this violence. He didn't contribute to whatever dysfunction had been building in that household for months or years. He wasn't the target, he was collateral damage. An innocent bystander killed in someone else's family violence. And that randomness makes grief harder to process. When someone dies from illness, family can contextualize it. Cancer, heart disease, age-related decline. When someone dies in an accident, there's at least the framework of tragic bad luck. Wrong place, wrong time, mechanical failure, unpredictable circumstances. But when someone dies because they were dating a woman whose son committed matricide, how do you make sense of that? How do you explain to his children why their father is gone? How do you process the injustice of a good man dying violently because he fell in love with someone whose family situation was more dangerous than anyone realized? Some of Marcus's relatives might harbor irrational resentment toward Nivia, even though intellectually they know the blame rests entirely on Javonte. They might think, if Marcus had never met her, he'd still be alive. If she hadn't been dealing with a homicidal son, our family member wouldn't have been in that apartment. If she'd called police when threats started, maybe this wouldn't have happened. Those thoughts aren't fair to Nivia. She's a victim too. She couldn't have known her son would actually kill her. But grief doesn't operate on fairness or logic. Marcus's children, their ages unknown from public records, but old enough to understand their father was murdered, lost him to violence that had nothing to do with them. They'll grow up with questions that have no satisfying answers. Why was Dad at that apartment? Why didn't he leave when the threats started? Why did someone else's family problem cost them their father? Why couldn't he have just stayed home that night? Why wasn't he more careful? Why did loving Nivia have to mean dying with her? There are no good answers to those questions. Marcus made reasonable decisions based on the information he had. He tried to protect his girlfriend. He stayed with her when she needed support. He alerted her family to dangers he recognized. He did what decent people do when someone they love is in trouble. And it got him killed. What transforms a son into his mother's executioner? This isn't rhetorical philosophy. It's a question forensic psychologists have studied through decades of matricide cases, searching for patterns that might predict or prevent such unthinkable violence. The research reveals several recurring profiles. Severe mental illness with paranoid delusions where sons become convinced mothers are poisoning them or conspiring with enemies. Extreme rage stemming from childhood abuse, real or perceived, that festers until it explodes. drug-induced psychosis that severs connection to reality and empathy, antisocial personality disorder where familial bonds never develop normally and mothers become obstacles to eliminate rather than people to love. Javonte Morris doesn't fit cleanly into any single diagnostic category. His case suggests something more insidious. A toxic psychological cocktail mixing dependency with resentment, entitlement with rage, building over years until his mother's eviction threat detonated everything. Consider his situation from a purely practical standpoint. At 21, Javonte was completely financially dependent on Nivia. He lived rent-free in her apartment, presumably consumed food she purchased, used utilities she paid for, had a roof over his head and his daughter's head because his mother provided it despite receiving nothing in return. No rent money, no contribution to groceries, no help with bills, apparently not even gratitude or respect. But financial dependency creates a specific kind of psychological poison, especially in young adult men who want autonomy but lack the skills, motivation, or work ethic to achieve it independently. He needed his mother's support while simultaneously hating that he needed it. He wanted independence but wouldn't do the work required. Finding employment, budgeting money, taking responsibility for himself and his daughter. So he blamed Nivia for his failures while requiring her continued support. This psychological bind appears constantly in cases where adult children kill parents who support them. They're trapped between childish dependence and adult rage at their own inadequacy. They see parents simultaneously as providers they can't survive without and authority figures preventing them from becoming whoever they fantasize they could be. When parents finally withdraw support through eviction, cutting off money, demanding accountability, dependent adult children sometimes interpret this not as necessary tough love but as existential threat. For Javonte, Nivia's eviction threat meant losing everything his life was built on. Free housing, probably built-in childcare from his mother for his daughter, financial cushion that allowed him to avoid working, the entire framework keeping him afloat despite contributing nothing himself. Where would he go if evicted? How would he support himself and a 4-year-old without job skills, work history, or savings? He hadn't prepared for independence because he'd never had to. His mother had always been there to catch him when he fell, to provide when he didn't provide for himself, to enable his refusal to grow up. Her support was his lifeline, and she was cutting it. For someone without resources or motivation to establish genuine independence, that threat doesn't register as, "Mom wants me to finally become an adult." It registers as annihilation. And some people, when faced with perceived annihilation of their entire world, choose to annihilate first. But here's what makes Javonte's case especially disturbing: the premeditation, the calculated nature of what he did. This wasn't momentary loss of control during a heated argument. He didn't snap in one explosive second and impulsively grab a weapon. The violence had been telegraphed for days through explicit, repeated warnings. Thursday, December 26th. Marcus texts Nivia's cousin that Javonte has been talking about he will smoke her. That's not vague threat language. Smoke is specific street terminology for murder. Friday, Nivia texts her cousin expressing intention to evict Javonte. Saturday, she texts again saying he's talking about shooting her. Escalation from general death threats to specific weapon. Then the phone call where Nivia's cousin hears Javonte threatening her, warning about shootouts with police, and, most chillingly, racking a firearm while announcing murderous intent. That's not impulsive violence. That's calculated execution preceded by clear, documented warnings over multiple days. He had time to think about what he was planning, time to reconsider, time to cool down or seek help or find literally any alternative to murder. Instead, he obtained a .380 handgun, loaded it, chambered a round while family listened on the phone, then shot his mother and her boyfriend multiple times at close range. The evidence demonstrates cognitive function and awareness of consequences. Impulsive violence happens in seconds. Someone grabs a kitchen knife during argument, stabs once in moment of blind rage, then immediately horrified by what they've done. But obtaining a firearm, making repeated threats showing awareness this was wrong, preparing the weapon while announcing intentions, then executing 2 people? That's deliberate. That's someone who had time to understand what they were choosing and chose it anyway. Mental health evaluations will be conducted as defense attorneys search for anything that might explain or mitigate his actions. They'll look for evidence of psychiatric disorders impairing his judgment. Major depression that made him suicidal and homicidal. PTSD from childhood trauma that warped his emotional regulation. Personality disorders affecting impulse control, empathy, and ability to maintain appropriate relationships. They need something, anything, that humanizes him enough that judges or juries might see him as damaged rather than purely evil, as sick rather than simply bad, as someone who needs treatment layered with punishment rather than punishment alone. But legal insanity in Illinois requires proving the defendant couldn't appreciate the wrongfulness of his actions or couldn't conform his behavior to law due to mental disease or defect. That's an extraordinarily high bar requiring genuine detachment from reality. Not just anger, not just poor impulse control, not just psychiatric disorders, but actual inability to understand that murder is wrong or inability to stop yourself even when you know it's wrong. Most murderers, even profoundly disturbed ones, don't meet that standard. They understand they're committing murder. They know it's illegal and morally wrong. They're capable of controlling themselves but choose not to. Javonte's behavior suggests he falls into that category. He armed himself beforehand, showing planning and future-oriented thinking. He made threats demonstrating knowledge that killing his mother would be wrong. Hence the threats rather than casual discussion of his plans. After the murders, he called 911 himself and fled to a nearby location rather than staying with the bodies or harming himself or showing complete break from reality. These actions demonstrate cognitive function, self-preservation instinct, and awareness of legal implications. Substance abuse will certainly be investigated thoroughly. Was he intoxicated when he pulled that trigger? Under influence of drugs that impaired his judgment or lowered his inhibitions? Illinois law is brutally clear. Voluntary intoxication isn't a legal defense. You can't argue, "I was drunk/high, so I didn't understand what I was doing," and expect acquittal. If you voluntarily consumed substances that impaired you, you're still responsible for your actions while impaired. But documented addiction might provide context for mitigation during sentencing phase. It might support arguments that he needs substance abuse treatment as part of his incarceration. It might marginally humanize him to sentencing judges by suggesting he's not purely evil but rather someone who made catastrophically bad decisions while struggling with addiction. It won't excuse the murders legally, but it might result in 45 years instead of natural life. The elephant in every room when this case is discussed. He committed double murder in front of his 4-year-old daughter. What kind of father destroys his child's grandmother and traumatizes her for life? Someone who either dissociates completely from parental identity during rage moments, or someone whose parenting was always questionable and whose daughter was never truly safe with him. January 21, 2026, 25 days after Javonte Morris murdered his mother and her boyfriend. He'll appear in court for preliminary hearing wearing orange jail scrubs, shackled at wrists and ankles, flanked by deputies. The courtroom will be packed. Media filling press section with cameras ready, victims' families radiating grief and rage, curious observers who read about the case and want to see the monster in person. Cook County Circuit Court judge will preside, reviewing charging documents to ensure procedural correctness. 2 counts of first-degree murder, each carrying 20 to 60 years in prison, with natural life possible under aggravating circumstances. This is as serious as Illinois criminal law gets since the state abolished the death penalty in 2011. Preliminary hearing's purpose is establishing probable cause, whether sufficient evidence exists to believe Javonte committed these murders. The standard is low. Prosecutors don't need to prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt at this stage, just that there's reasonable basis to believe he's guilty. Defense attorneys sometimes waive preliminary hearings, recognizing the state will easily meet this burden. But sometimes they proceed, using hearings to extract information through cross-examination that helps prepare for trial. Prosecutors will call witnesses, probably the first responding officer who found Javonte behind the garage at Canterbury Court, who entered the apartment and discovered 2 bodies and a traumatized child. Maybe the detective who processed the crime scene, photographed evidence, collected those 5 shell casings and the .380 Smith & Wesson bodyguard. Possibly the forensic interviewer who spoke with the 4-year-old and heard her describe pulling the blanket off Gigi and seeing leaking blood. Each witness will provide pieces of the overwhelming evidence. Javonte's 911 call where he reported a shooting without identifying himself as the shooter. His flight from the scene. The murder weapon. The shell casings. The autopsy results showing multiple gunshot wounds on both victims. The child's testimony placing him at the scene, establishing motive, confirming sequence of events. Defense attorneys will cross-examine, looking for weaknesses that might help during trial. Did officers follow proper procedures? Was evidence chain of custody maintained? Could ballistics experts definitively match recovered bullets to that specific gun? Were there any alternative explanations for what happened? But realistically, guilt isn't disputable here. Javonte was caught immediately. His daughter witnessed the murders. Physical evidence is overwhelming. The question isn't whether he'll be bound over for trial. He absolutely will be. The question is what happens next. Plea negotiations or trial. Plea negotiations dominate most murder cases because trials are expensive, time-consuming, and risky for both sides. Prosecutors know they have airtight evidence, but trials still require resources and carry small chances of unexpected outcomes. If Javonte pleads guilty and accepts lengthy sentence, perhaps 40 or 50 years, the state saves money while guaranteeing conviction and substantial punishment. Defense knows trial is likely futile, but pleading guilty means surrendering all hope, however unrealistic, of acquittal. It means telling a 21-year-old he'll spend the next 4 or 5 decades in prison, that he'll be elderly if he ever breathes free air again, that his daughter will be middle-aged before he's even eligible for parole consideration. That's a psychologically brutal conversation. But matricide cases rarely settle cheap. Public outrage means prosecutors face political pressure for maximum sentences. Cook County State's attorney is an elected official who can't appear soft on someone who murdered his mother in front of his 4-year-old daughter. Even if plea deals make practical sense, optics might prevent them. Discovery is extensive. Defense receives everything prosecutors plan to use. Crime scene photos showing Nivia and Marcus dead on the floor, blood spreading across carpet. Autopsy reports detailing every wound trajectory, which shots proved immediately fatal. Ballistics analysis connecting recovered bullets to the .380 handgun. Text messages between Nivia and her cousin. Recordings of 911 calls. The forensic interview with the 4-year-old where she describes leaking blood and Marcus struggling to breathe. They'll also receive exculpatory evidence. Anything suggesting innocence or mitigating culpability that prosecution discovers. Withholding exculpatory evidence is prosecutorial misconduct that can overturn convictions, so states' attorneys are legally obligated to provide it. But in this case, there likely isn't any exculpatory evidence to provide. The 4-year-old's forensic interview will be scrutinized intensely by defense experts. They'll review interview techniques looking for leading questions or suggestive language that contaminated her memory. Children are highly susceptible to suggestion. Did Daddy shoot Gigi? Differs fundamentally from what happened at the apartment. The first plants ideas. The second elicits organic memory. But the prosecutor's proffer provides devastating details that a 4-year-old couldn't fabricate. The argument about eviction triggering violence, pulling the blanket off her grandmother and seeing blood, watching Marcus Jones struggle to breathe with blood flowing from his mouth. These are trauma memories seared into developing brain, not coach testimony. The apartment at 22500 Jackson Court doesn't exist as a home anymore. It's a crime scene first, then eventually just another rental unit where tragedy occurred but life continues because buildings don't remember trauma even when survivors do. Someone, probably Nivia's estate, had to make decisions about the lease. Terminate and lose the security deposit? Maintain it and keep paying rent on a place no one can psychologically bear to enter? Crime scene cleaning companies arrived once investigators released the scene. Professionals wearing protective equipment, carrying industrial chemicals, prepared to handle what most people couldn't stomach. Blood had soaked into carpet, walls, furniture, biological hazards requiring specialized removal and disposal. The metallic smell of death permeated everything. These cleaners work silently, efficiently, charging thousands of dollars to erase physical evidence of violence while knowing they can't erase emotional scars. Nivia's belongings required sorting. Family members entered that apartment, probably wearing masks because smell was overwhelming despite cleaning, definitely crying because everywhere held memories. Her clothes still hung in the closet, toiletries in bathroom, photos on walls showing her smiling, alive, before her son destroyed everything. These items had to be packed, sorted, distributed among family or discarded. Every object a reminder. Personal items, photos, jewelry, meaningful objects were distributed among relatives. The 4-year-old granddaughter will eventually receive mementos, things to remember the grandmother she barely knew before watching her die. A necklace, perhaps. Photos of birthdays and holidays. Tangible connections to a person existing now only in fragmented memories and traumatic flashbacks. But some decisions are about more than sentiment. They're about survival. If Nivia had life insurance, beneficiaries had to be determined. Policies usually name children, but Illinois Slayer statutes prevent murderers from inheriting from victims. Javonte would get nothing. No insurance money, no assets, no benefit whatsoever from his mother's death. Everything would be redirected to secondary beneficiaries or to the granddaughter. Marcus Jones' family faced their own nightmare logistics. At least his apartment wasn't the crime scene, so they could sort his belongings without confronting blood and death. But emotional complexity remained. He died violently in someone else's family conflict, a randomness making grief harder to process. Why was he there? Why didn't he leave when threats started? Why did loving Nivia cost him his life? Funerals happened in early January, probably separate services because combining them would be too complicated, too painful, too weird given the circumstances. Nivia's service likely included church, given that many Black American families maintain strong religious connections. Pastor speaking about senseless tragedy, God's mysterious plans, finding peace in faith. Mourners crying, hugging, sharing memories before horror overwrote everything. Closed caskets almost certainly given gunshot wounds. Restoring bodies to viewable condition after violent death requires extensive mortuary work, and families often decide living relatives should remember the deceased as they were, not as violence left them. Closed caskets also spare attendees from confronting physical brutality of multiple gunshot wounds. The 4-year-old entered therapy immediately. Child psychologists specializing in trauma used play therapy and age-appropriate techniques to help her process what she'd witnessed. But at 4 years old, she couldn't fully articulate her experience. Play revealed her internal world instead. Dolls reenacting violence, drawings showing figures and red crayon blood, regression in developmental milestones like toilet training and speech patterns. Statistics on children who witness parental violence paint grim pictures. Dramatically increased rates of PTSD, depression, anxiety disorders, substance abuse in adolescence and adulthood, higher likelihood of perpetrating violence themselves. Early intervention helps but doesn't eliminate risk. She'll need therapy for years, maybe decades, as each developmental stage brings new understanding of trauma she survived. Child Protective Services worked on permanent placement. Foster care becomes necessary when family placement isn't viable due to dysfunction, financial incapacity, or safety concerns. Relatives had to be evaluated, home inspections, background checks, financial reviews, interviews. Family often finds this invasive and insulting, but children need protection from well-meaning relatives who aren't actually safe or stable. Her relationship with her father is destroyed beyond any possibility of repair. She's too young to maintain connection with incarcerated parent under these circumstances, and no mental health professional would recommend visits. She needs safety, stability, healing, not continued exposure to the man who murdered her grandmother while she hid under a table watching. Javonte Morris sits in Cook County Jail awaiting trial, housed in protective custody because inmates who kill their mothers rank low in prison hierarchies. Other prisoners view attacking him as justice or entertainment. Guards must protect him from violence while he waits for legal system to determine whether he spends 40, 50, 60 years or natural life in prison. Young defendants often struggle to comprehend long-term consequences. At 21 years old, even 40 years sounds impossible. He'd be 61 before parole eligibility. But compared to natural life, which means dying in prison, it's meaningful difference. His public defender must explain brutal reality. Trial means definite conviction and probably life sentence. Pleading guilty might get 40 to 50 years, meaning potential release in his 60s instead of never. If he eventually reaches parole eligibility decades from now, his daughter will be middle-aged. She'll have built entire adult life, career, possibly marriage and children, established identity separate from trauma. Will she want contact with him? Will she testify at parole hearings begging board to keep him incarcerated? Will she forgive? Or will she simply not remember him beyond therapy discussions and court transcripts describing what he did? Parole boards consider crime severity, institutional behavior, rehabilitation evidence, victim input, recidivism risk. Having murdered his mother weighs catastrophically against him. Having traumatized his daughter by forcing her to witness, it makes him seem irredeemable. He'll likely face multiple parole denials spanning decades before any board considers release, if that day ever comes. December 27th will never be ordinary again for anyone connected to this case. Christmas season will forever carry shadow of what came after. The 4-year-old will likely experience heightened anxiety each December as her subconscious remembers trauma timing even before conscious mind can articulate why. The real questions remain unanswered and unanswerable. Could this have been prevented if Nivia had called police when Javonte first threatened her? Would intervention have saved lives or merely delayed inevitable violence? What mental health infrastructure might have changed his trajectory before murder became his language? How does mother balance love for troubled adult child against recognition that child has become genuinely dangerous? Domestic violence between intimate partners receives significant attention, funding, resources, public awareness campaigns. But violence between adult children and parents remains understudied, underaddressed, carrying stigma that prevents families from seeking help until too late. Parents feel shame admitting their children threaten them. They feel like failures. They fear judgment, and that silence kills. Mental health infrastructure in America remains catastrophically inadequate. People needing treatment can't access or afford it. Crisis intervention comes too late. Families struggle without support until tragedies occur. Then everyone asks why warning signs were ignored, as if families have power to force treatment on unwilling adult relatives. The cousin who heard that gun being racked will carry survivor's guilt forever. They'd known violence was imminent. They'd urged police intervention. They'd called 911 themselves. But Nivia made her own choices, and adults can't be forced into protective custody based on family fears. Rationally, the cousin understands this. Emotionally, they'll replay those final conversations for the rest of their lives. Nivia Phillips is dead at 38. Marcus Jones is dead at 45. A 4-year-old girl is traumatized permanently. Javonte Morris will spend most or all of his remaining life in prison. Multiple families are shattered. And Richton Park, Illinois, will remember December 27, 2025, as the day a son murdered his mother while his daughter watched, destroying 3 generations in minutes of rage that could never be undone. This is the reality of ignored warning signs, failed interventions, and a family that couldn't save itself despite seeing danger coming. If this case taught you anything about recognizing threats before they become tragedies, share this video. Comment below with your thoughts on what could have prevented this. And subscribe to Crime Case Voices, because understanding how these tragedies happen is the first step toward preventing the next one. The warning signs are always there. The question is, will we pay attention before it's too late? Until next time, stay safe, stay aware,